Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The fur trade was a transformative chapter in the history of North America, shaping the continent in profound ways that still resonate today. Imagine vast wildernesses filled with beavers, whose pelts were once so valuable they rivaled gold, driving exploration, alliances, and conflict across the land. This trade was not just about commerce. It was a catalyst for economic growth, cultural exchange, and territorial expansion. At its core, the fur trade involved the exchange of animal pelts, especially beaver fur, between indigenous peoples and European traders, fueling an industry that became central to the early economy. Its importance lay in how it connected diverse groups, encouraged exploration into uncharted territories, and established trade networks that would evolve into the backbone of emerging nations. The fur trade laid critical foundations for economic prosperity by promoting commerce and settlement, influenced social structures through interactions between indigenous peoples and Europeans, and affected political developments by prompting territorial claims and governance strategies. Ultimately, the fur trade's legacy is integral to understanding the formation and growth of countries like Canada and the United States. Long before Europeans set foot in North America, indigenous peoples had established complex and extensive fur trading networks that spanned vast regions. These networks were built on deep knowledge of the land, animal behavior, and seasonal cycles. Indigenous communities traded furs and other goods not only for practical needs, but also as part of cultural exchanges, forming alliances and strengthening social bonds across tribes. Their sophisticated systems of trade laid the groundwork for what would later become a booming industry. With the arrival of European explorers and traders, primarily the French, British, and Dutch, the fur trade entered a new and transformative phase. Europeans quickly recognized the immense value of North American furs, especially beaver pelts, which were in high demand back in Europe. The popularity of beaver hats, a fashionable and status symbol accessory in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, drove this demand. This demand spurred European powers to establish trading relationships with indigenous peoples and to explore deeper into the continent in search of fur resources. To facilitate the trade, Europeans began to set up early trading posts along major waterways and routes. These posts became vital hubs where indigenous trappers and hunters exchanged furs for European goods such as metal tools, firearms, cloth, and beads. These posts, often located at strategic points like river confluences, became the seeds of future settlements and economic centers. The establishment of these trading routes and posts not only helped expand the fur trade, but also played a crucial role in mapping and claiming territories, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the continent for centuries to come. Indigenous peoples were the cornerstone of the fur trade, serving as expert trappers, hunters, and skilled negotiators who understood the land and its resources intimately. Their knowledge of animal behavior, migration patterns, and the natural environment was essential to securing high-quality pelts. Far from passive participants, indigenous communities actively shaped the trade through their networks and diplomacy, often controlling the flow of goods and setting terms for exchange. Their role was not only economic but also cultural, as the fur trade deeply influenced their societies, alliances, and ways of life. European involvement in the fur trade was dominated by powerful companies that operated as both commercial enterprises and instruments of colonial expansion. The Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, became one of the most influential players, controlling vast territories around Hudson Bay and establishing a network of trading posts that linked Europe to the fur-rich interior of North America. Meanwhile, the Northwest Company, formed later in the 18th century, fiercely competed with Hudson's Bay Company, pushing further west and north, often relying heavily on alliances with indigenous peoples. Other smaller companies and traders also contributed to this complex web of trade, each seeking to profit from the lucrative market for furs in Europe. Several key figures stand out in the history of the fur trade, both European and indigenous, whose actions helped shape its course. Explorers such as Samuel de Champlain and Alexander Mackenzie opened new routes and territories, often working closely with indigenous guides and partners. Traders like Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Simon McTavish played major roles in expanding and managing fur trade companies, navigating the challenges of commerce and diplomacy. Indigenous leaders such as Chief Tecumseh and the Cree and Ojibwe chiefs were instrumental in negotiating trade agreements, maintaining peace, and resisting encroachment on their lands. Together, these individuals and groups created a dynamic, often complicated, network that fueled the growth of the fur trade and left a lasting impact on North America's development. The fur trade was a powerful engine for economic growth in the early settlements of North America. It created a vibrant market that connected remote wilderness areas with bustling European cities, turning animal pelts into valuable commodities that fueled the prosperity of both indigenous communities and European colonists. The profits from the fur trade helped finance further exploration, settlement, and development, laying the groundwork for the economies of emerging nations. This commerce also encouraged the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies, accelerating economic activity beyond simple subsistence. One of the most lasting impacts of the fur trade was the creation of trading posts, which often began as small, strategically placed outposts for collecting and exchanging furs. Over time, many of these posts grew into thriving towns and cities. For example, places like Winnipeg in Canada and St. Louis in the United States trace their origins to fur trade hubs. These settlements became centers of commerce, culture, and governance, anchoring colonial presence deep into the continent. The fur trade thus directly contributed to the demographic and urban development of North America. The quest for furs also drove extensive exploration and mapping of the continent. Traders, explorers, and indigenous guides pushed into previously unknown territories, charting rivers, mountains, and vast forests. This knowledge was crucial not only for expanding the fur trade but also for asserting political control over lands. Detailed maps created during this era provided the basis for future settlement, resource extraction, and border negotiations. The fur trade, in essence, served as a catalyst for the geographical and political shaping of the continent. To facilitate the movement of goods, extensive trade routes were established across vast territories, often following rivers, lakes, and natural portage paths. These routes connected the interior to coastal trading centers and ultimately to Europe. Canoes, sleds, and later ships navigated these pathways, allowing furs to flow efficiently from indigenous hunters to European markets. These trade networks fostered cooperation and competition among various indigenous nations and European powers, weaving a complex web of economic and social relationships. The fur trade routes became the arteries of early North American commerce, enabling the expansion and integration of vast, diverse regions into a shared economic system. The fur trade was much more than an economic enterprise. It was a profound social and cultural crossroads where diverse peoples met, interacted, and shaped one another's lives. At trading posts and along trade routes, indigenous peoples and European traders came into regular contact, exchanging not only goods, but also customs, languages, and ideas. This interaction created unique cultural landscapes marked by cooperation, negotiation, and sometimes conflict, as different worldviews and ways of life intersected. One of the most significant outcomes of the fur trade was the development of strong relationships and alliances between indigenous communities and European traders. These partnerships were often based on mutual benefit. Indigenous trappers provided the furs essential to European markets, while Europeans supplied tools, weapons, and other goods valued by indigenous peoples. These alliances were sometimes formalized through intermarriage, gift exchanges, and diplomatic agreements, which helped maintain peace and foster trust in an often competitive and dangerous environment. However, these relationships could also be fraught with tension, as shifting power dynamics and competition for resources occasionally led to disputes and violence. A unique cultural group that emerged directly from the fur trade era is the Métis, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry. The Métis developed their own distinct identity, language, Michif, and traditions, blending elements of both indigenous and European cultures. They played a crucial role as intermediaries in the fur trade, bridging cultural divides and facilitating communication and commerce between indigenous nations and European settlers. The Métis community became a vital part of the social fabric of the fur trade regions, influencing politics, culture, and economy well beyond the trade itself. At the same time, the fur trade brought significant changes and challenges to indigenous ways of life. Increased dependence on European goods altered traditional economic and social structures, sometimes undermining indigenous autonomy. The intense demand for furs led to overhunting, disrupting ecosystems and traditional hunting patterns. Additionally, the introduction of European diseases had devastating effects on indigenous populations. Despite these hardships, many indigenous peoples adapted and resisted, maintaining their cultural identities and sovereignty in the face of profound change. The fur trade era, therefore, stands as a complex chapter marked by cultural blending, resilience, and transformation. The fur trade had far-reaching political consequences that significantly influenced the colonial landscape of North America. Competition over rich fur-bearing territories became a driving force behind colonial policies as European powers sought to control valuable resources and expand their influence. Both the British and French, along with other European nations, implemented strategies to secure alliances with indigenous groups and assert sovereignty over vast regions. This rivalry shaped diplomatic efforts, military actions, and governance structures aimed at consolidating control over the fur trade and the lands it depended on. One of the most lasting political impacts of the fur trade was its role in defining borders and territorial claims. The locations of trading posts, the routes traders used, and the territories claimed by powerful companies like the Hudson's Bay Company became markers for European colonial boundaries. These claims often overlapped and conflicted, leading to negotiations, treaties, and sometimes violent confrontations. For example, disputes between British and French interests contributed to larger conflicts like the 7 Years' War, which ultimately reshaped the political map of North America. The fur trade, therefore, was not just an economic activity, but a catalyst for territorial disputes and colonial expansion. Rivalries within the fur trade itself, between companies like the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, fueled political tensions and alliances both among Europeans and indigenous nations. These companies competed fiercely for control of trade routes and alliances, sometimes resulting in armed clashes known as the Pemmican Wars. Indigenous groups also navigated these rivalries carefully, aligning with different factions to protect their interests or gain advantages, which in turn influenced broader colonial power dynamics. These alliances and conflicts highlight how the fur trade was deeply entangled with the politics of the region. Ultimately, the fur trade laid important groundwork for the formation of modern nations. In Canada, the trade's extensive networks helped establish economic and territorial foundations that contributed to the country's westward expansion and the eventual confederation. In the United States, the push for fur trade resources propelled explorers and settlers westward, accelerating the country's territorial growth and shaping its frontier policies. The political legacies of the fur trade, through borders drawn, alliances forged, and conflicts fought, were integral to the emergence of the nations that now occupy the continent. Several key factors contributed to the decline of the fur trade. By the mid-19th century, one major cause was changing fashion trends in Europe. The once coveted beaver hats fell out of favor, replaced by silk and other materials, drastically reducing demand for furs. Additionally, overtrapping had severely depleted fur-bearing animal populations, making it harder and more expensive to sustain the trade. The rise of industrialization also shifted economic focus toward manufacturing and new markets, diminishing the fur trade's central role in the economy. As the fur trade waned, many regions transitioned toward other industries such as agriculture, timber harvesting, and mining. Settlements that had grown around trading posts evolved into farming communities or resource extraction centers, reflecting the changing economic landscape. This shift helped diversify local economies and contributed to the development of infrastructure like railways and roads, further integrating these areas into national and global markets. Despite its decline, the fur trade left a lasting legacy on national identity, the economy, and indigenous relations. The networks and settlements established during the fur trade era became foundations for modern cities and provinces. The interactions and alliances forged during this time shaped ongoing relationships between indigenous peoples and the state, influencing policies and cultural identities. In many ways, the fur trade era helped define the early character and trajectory of nations like Canada and the United States, making it a pivotal chapter in their histories that continues to be remembered and studied today. The fur trade played a foundational role in building the nations of North America, serving as a catalyst for economic growth, cultural exchange, and political development. From the earliest indigenous trading networks to the vast colonial enterprises of European powers, the fur trade shaped settlement patterns, forged critical alliances, and drove exploration into the continent's interior. Its impact went beyond commerce, touching social structures, cultural identities, and the very borders that define modern countries. Even today, the legacy of the fur trade is evident in the cultural diversity, economic foundations, and political landscapes of countries like Canada and the United States. The emergence of the Métis people, the establishment of key cities, and the complex relationships between Indigenous nations and the state all trace back to this era. Understanding the fur trade allows us to appreciate how intertwined histories and cultures helped shape national identities, reminding us that the story of a nation is often built on the exchange, cooperation, and sometimes conflict between diverse peoples. By studying the fur trade, we gain a richer perspective on our shared past, one that acknowledges the contributions and challenges of all those involved. This awareness deepens our appreciation for the complexities of national history and helps inform how we move forward together today.